I came back, not for revenge, but for love.
Millionaire thought he was marrying an ugly woman, but he was shocked when she suddenly... Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I've got a quick favor to ask. Would you mind hitting that subscribe button and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our new videos? It's totally free, takes just a second, and it's the absolute best way to support our channel and help us bring you more of these dramatic stories. Your support truly means the world to us. Also, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We'd love to know. Thank you so much. Now, let's get back to our main character. On a bleak autumn morning in New York City, a shiny black limousine purred to a stop in front of a towering cathedral. The man who emerged was Ethan Lancaster, the sole heir to one of the most powerful real estate empires in the entire country. His tuxedo was absolutely perfect. His expression was icy, and his whole demeanor just radiated power and a kind of bored indifference. This was supposed to be his wedding day, a day filled with joy and celebration. But his heart was heavy, filled not with joy, but with a deep resentment. Ethan hadn't chosen this marriage. It was an arrangement, a deal brokered by his father to solidify a merger with another incredibly wealthy family. To Ethan, it felt far less like a wedding and much more like a hostile business takeover, and the whispers he'd been hearing made the whole thing even worse. His bride-to-be had been described as plain, unattractive, someone completely unworthy of standing next to a man of his stature. An ugly woman, they'd called her, as if she were some sort of unfortunate blot on his otherwise perfect life. Ethan had accepted his fate with a tight jaw, convincing himself that it would all just be a contract on paper, a business agreement with no real emotional connection. Inside the cathedral, guests in shimmering gowns and perfectly tailored suits filled the pews. The air was thick with gossip, with everyone buzzing and whispering, all of them desperate to finally catch a glimpse of the mysterious bride who had somehow been promised to the city's most eligible billionaire. The whispers carried a tone of cruel mockery, as if they were all waiting for some kind of embarrassing spectacle to unfold before their eyes. Then the music began. The massive doors creaked open, and a woman stepped forward, her face carefully hidden beneath a delicate veil. She wore a simple, understated gown, nothing like the extravagant dresses that most wealthy brides would flaunt on such an occasion. Her steps were measured and steady, her shoulders were squared, but her silence was absolutely deafening. The crowd leaned forward, murmuring cruel and thoughtless remarks that floated through the church like a deadly poison. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. To him, this wasn't a celebration. It was a gilded cage, a trap he was forced to walk into. He didn't glance at her with any affection, only with a sense of weary resignation. He thought to himself, "This marriage is nothing but a sham, a charade for the benefit of others, and I'm going to keep my distance. She can live her life however she chooses, and I'll live mine. I don't owe her anything except my name on a piece of paper." But while Ethan's eyes were clouded by prejudice, the woman beneath the veil was clenching her hands tightly around a small sketchbook that she had hidden within her bouquet. She whispered to herself, almost like a mantra, "Hold your dignity. Don't let them break you. Not today." And so, beneath the soaring arches of the cathedral, a union was sealed. A union born not of love, but of obligation, of duty, and of financial necessity. Yet destiny, as it often does, had its own script, a script filled with unexpected twists and turns. And Ethan Lancaster was about to discover, in a way he never anticipated, that absolutely nothing was as it seemed. The wedding ceremony was over, but the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, more cruel. As Ethan and his new bride, Isabella, emerged from the cathedral, the crowd waiting outside was no kinder, no more compassionate than the guests inside. Reporters leaned over the velvet ropes, their camera flashes firing relentlessly, all of them hungry for a juicy scandal, for any hint of a crack in the facade. Is this really the woman who managed to snag the Lancaster heir? One voice sneered with blatant disdain. Look at her gown, another mocked cruelly. She looks like some commoner trying to dress up as a princess. Ethan ignored them all, his hand resting only loosely on Isabella's arm as he guided her toward the waiting limousine. He didn't look at her, didn't offer her a reassuring smile. To him, she was still a stranger, someone forced into his life through a contract that had been signed by their families. Inside the car, a heavy silence wrapped around them, thick and suffocating. Isabella kept her eyes down, focused on her own folded hands, the sketchbook still hidden beneath the layers of fabric of her dress. She could hear her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears, louder than the sound of the city rushing past outside the windows. Ethan glanced at her once, almost involuntarily, but quickly turned his head to stare out the window, his jaw tight with tension. At the Lancaster estate, a sprawling mansion set amidst acres of perfectly manicured lawns, the wedding reception was already in full swing. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, illuminating golden tables laden with food, and the air was filled with the scent of roses and ridiculously expensive wine. Guests dressed in jewels and silk dresses whispered and gossiped as Isabella entered the hall on Ethan's arm, their stares sharper and more cutting than any blade. "Poor Ethan," one woman whispered from behind her diamond-encrusted mask. "Trapped with a wife like that. His father must have really forced this on him." "She'll never belong here," another said with a dismissive shrug. Isabella heard every single word. She walked with her head held high, refusing to let her posture falter or bend under the weight of their contempt and judgment. Ethan, however, remained stone-faced, offering no defense, no shield against their cruelty. He simply stood there, letting her absorb the blows. During the dinner, Ethan excused himself to speak with some important business partners, leaving Isabella alone and vulnerable at the table. A group of women, their perfume cloyingly sweet, but their words laced with venom, approached her. "Your dress looks so simple," one of them said, her eyes glinting with thinly veiled disdain. "Did you borrow it from a thrift store?" Another giggled, as if she'd just made the wittiest remark imaginable. "You must be incredibly lucky," a third added, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Men like Ethan don't usually marry women who look like you." Their laughter stung, but Isabella's lips curved into a soft, calm smile. She answered them gently, her voice steady. "Sometimes luck isn't about what people see on the surface, but about what they fail to see beneath it." Her words silenced them, at least for a moment, though the cruel mockery quickly resumed once they turned away, their whispers like buzzing flies. Across the room, Ethan noticed the exchange, but he consciously chose not to interfere. To him, it was simply easier to let her fight her own battles. After all, this wasn't a marriage of love, but of obligation, a business arrangement, and he felt no real responsibility to protect her from the petty cruelties of society. Later that night, after the guests had finally gone and the lights had dimmed, Isabella retreated to a small balcony that overlooked the gardens. She opened her sketchbook, letting the cool night air brush against her face and through her veil. On the first page was a detailed sketch of the cathedral doors, tall and heavy, but drawn with a single crack of light streaming through. She whispered to herself again, repeating her earlier mantra, "Hold your dignity. No matter what they say, hold your dignity." Inside the mansion, Ethan stood at a distance, watching her through the glass doors. For the first time that day, his gaze softened, though he quickly turned away before she could notice, as if ashamed of his own momentary lapse in indifference. He told himself that it meant absolutely nothing, that she was still just the woman he'd been forced to marry, a necessary component of a business deal. But deep down, a question stirred within him, an unsettling feeling he couldn't quite ignore. Why did her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of such blatant cruelty, unsettle him so much? Days turned into weeks, and the Lancaster mansion seemed to grow colder, more desolate, with every passing sunrise. To outsiders, Ethan and Isabella presented the picture of a perfect couple. They appeared together at charity galas, formal dinners, and important business functions, always impeccably dressed and composed. But beneath the polished surface, their lives were nothing more than parallel lines that never truly touched, never intersected. In the mornings, Isabella often sat alone at the impossibly long dining table, the silverware gleaming, the expensive plates untouched. Ethan would come downstairs dressed in perfectly tailored suits, his phone already pressed to his ear, already absorbed in business deals before the day had even properly begun. He would nod at her politely, but the nod carried the weight of distance, not affection. "Good morning," she would say softly, her voice barely audible. "Morning," he would reply, his voice flat and dismissive, his eyes already drifting away, back to his phone, his business, his real life. At night, Ethan worked late in his study, poring over documents and taking calls, leaving Isabella to wander the mansion's endless halls in silence, a ghost in her own home. She spent hours in a small library tucked away in a quiet corner of the estate, filling her sketchbook with drawings of places she longed to see. A crowded marketplace filled with laughter and vibrant colors, a quiet cafe by the river, a home that felt warm and welcoming, not just grand and imposing. One evening, Isabella was setting a tray of food outside Ethan's study door. She knocked gently, her knuckles barely making a sound against the heavy wood. "You haven't eaten all day," she said, her voice soft with concern. There was no answer from within, only the rustle of papers and the low hum of his voice as he spoke on a call. She left the tray and walked away, her heart heavy with a sense of loneliness. Hours later, when she passed by again, the tray was still untouched, the food cold and unappetizing. Despite his outward coldness, Ethan couldn't completely ignore Isabella's presence. Sometimes he would walk past the library and catch a fleeting glimpse of her bent over her sketchbook, the soft lamplight illuminating her face. He never lingered long enough for her to notice him, but something in her quiet determination, her unwavering focus, stirred a sense of unease within him, a feeling that he couldn't quite explain. At social events, Isabella continued to be the target of whispers and snide remarks. One evening, during a charity banquet, a wealthy socialite leaned close to Ethan and said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "It's such a shame, Lancaster. A man of your status, saddled with such a dull wife." Ethan didn't respond. He simply took a sip of his drink, his face unreadable, carefully masking his true emotions. Isabella heard the remark, but she didn't flinch, didn't betray any sign of hurt. She excused herself gracefully, leaving behind a silence that unsettled the socialite more than any angry retort could have. Back at the mansion, Isabella's strength began to manifest itself in small, subtle ways. She spoke with the staff kindly, remembering each of their names, listening to their stories, treating them with respect and dignity. She helped the gardener plant roses near the fountain, her hands stained with soil, yet her smile remaining calm and serene. The mansion, once cold and lifeless, began to carry faint traces of warmth wherever she walked, a subtle but undeniable change in atmosphere. But for Ethan, the walls of distance remained firmly in place. In his mind, this marriage was still nothing more than an arrangement, a contract binding two families together, a business deal with no emotional component. Yet at night, when he stood alone on the balcony, staring out over the glittering city skyline, he couldn't erase the image of Isabella's steady eyes, her quiet resilience, her unwavering dignity. She was supposed to be invisible to him, insignificant, a mere pawn in a larger game. And yet, piece by piece, she was unsettling the fortress he had built around his heart, chipping away at his carefully constructed walls of indifference. The icy routine of their marriage was finally broken one rainy evening, an evening that would change everything. The sky over Manhattan cracked with thunder, and the torrential downpour turned the city streets into rivers of silver. Ethan had been delayed at the office, stuck in meetings that seemed to drag on forever, and Isabella waited alone for him at the mansion, her worry growing with each passing hour despite her best efforts to remain calm. When the sound of tires screeching in the driveway finally shattered the silence, she hurried outside, grabbing an umbrella as she went. Ethan stepped out of his car, his expensive suit soaked through, his hair dripping with rain. He looked utterly exhausted, his eyes shadowed from the endless meetings and the stress of his demanding life. Without a word, Isabella raised the umbrella over his head, shielding him from the downpour. "You'll catch a cold if you stay out in this," she said gently, her voice filled with genuine concern. For a moment, Ethan just stared at her, taken aback by her unexpected gesture. The concern in her voice was quiet, but undeniably genuine, something he wasn't used to hearing directed toward him. He almost wanted to thank her, but the walls around his heart were still too high, too strong, forcing him to look away, to mask his vulnerability. "I'm fine," he muttered, brushing past her as he headed toward the entrance. Later that night, Ethan returned to his study only to find a cup of warm tea waiting for him on his desk. He frowned, knowing that Isabella must have left it there. He reached for it, hesitated for a moment, then finally took a cautious sip. It was the first time in weeks that he felt the tension in his body ease even slightly, even if he would never admit it aloud, even to himself. Days later, another unexpected moment disrupted their carefully maintained distance. The Lancaster family hosted a luncheon with some important international partners, a crucial event for the future of the business. Isabella had been asked to attend, but Ethan doubted that she would be able to withstand the intense scrutiny, the judgment, the subtle cruelties of the business world. He fully expected her to falter, to embarrass herself, and, by extension, him. Yet, as the meeting unfolded, Isabella surprised him in ways he couldn't have imagined. When one of the guests made a cutting, thinly veiled remark about her plain appearance, she responded not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with a calm intelligence that silenced the room. She gracefully shifted the conversation to art and architecture, her voice steady and confident, her knowledge surprisingly sharp and insightful. The partners listened, genuinely intrigued, their initial judgments completely forgotten. Ethan sat beside her, carefully hiding his surprise, wondering where she had acquired such knowledge and poise. Afterward, as they walked back to the car, he finally spoke, his curiosity overcoming his usual indifference. "Where did you learn all of that?" Isabella looked at him, her eyes unwavering, her gaze direct and honest. "I read, I listen, I observe. Just because people dismiss me doesn't mean I have nothing to say." Her words lingered with him long after the car had pulled away from the venue, echoing in his mind, forcing him to reconsider his preconceived notions about her. That night, Ethan passed by the library and noticed her sketchbook lying open on the desk. He should have simply walked away, continued on his path of carefully maintained distance, but something compelled him to draw closer. The pages were filled with delicate drawings, intricate city skylines, lush gardens, and haunting portraits of faces full of life and emotion. At the very end, he found a sketch of the cathedral where they had been wed, the light streaming through the heavy doors, just as she had captured it in her mind. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't the work of someone insignificant, someone dull or uninspired. This was the work of someone who saw beauty in places others ignored. Someone with a unique and valuable perspective. He closed the book quickly, feeling ashamed for intruding on her private world. But the images were already burned into his mind, impossible to ignore. The next morning, when Isabella greeted him at breakfast, he almost spoke, almost thanked her for her unexpected strength, almost apologized for his years of indifference. But the words caught in his throat, trapped behind the walls he had built so carefully. Instead, he simply nodded, his usual coldness slightly softened, a subtle crack in his carefully constructed facade. For the first time since their marriage, Ethan Lancaster began to see Isabella not as a burden, not as a stranger forced into his life, but as a mystery he had profoundly misjudged. And that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The fragile balance between Ethan and Isabella shattered completely one evening when the past came knocking, shattering the present with its force. The Lancaster family hosted a grand gala at their estate, inviting politicians, business magnates, and the most influential members of New York society. Crystal chandeliers glittered above the ballroom, casting a warm glow on the scene below, and violins serenaded the guests with elegant melodies that mingled with the murmur of polite conversation. Among the crowd was Cassandra Hale, Ethan's former fiancée, a woman of striking beauty and polished charm, a woman who knew exactly how to command attention. She glided across the marble floor in a crimson gown that caught every eye, radiating confidence and sophistication. When her gaze landed on Ethan, she smiled, her expression a calculated mixture of longing and triumph. "Ethan," she purred, placing a perfectly manicured hand possessively on his arm. "It's been far too long. I see you've settled down." Her eyes flicked dismissively toward Isabella, who stood quietly at his side, her presence almost an afterthought. The words stung, sharp and cruel, though Isabella didn't react outwardly. She kept her posture calm, her face unreadable, but inside her heart clenched with a familiar pain. Cassandra's voice carried through the hall, loud enough for others to overhear, designed to humiliate and demean. "I must admit, I was absolutely shocked when I learned of your marriage. Of all the women you could have chosen, you ended up with this." A ripple of cruel laughter spread among the onlookers, their whispers echoing through the room like poison. Isabella's cheeks burned with shame, but she refused to lower her head, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She clasped her hands tightly around the sketchbook she had tucked into her purse, whispering silently to herself, "Hold your dignity. Don't let them see you cry." Ethan stood frozen, his lips parted as if he wanted to defend her, but his pride, his ingrained sense of obligation to maintain appearances, chained him into silence. His failure to act, his cowardice in the face of such blatant cruelty, cut deeper than Cassandra's words. Isabella glanced at him, her eyes filled with a quiet pain, and in that moment she realized that he wouldn't protect her, that she was entirely alone. Later that night, after the music had faded and the guests had departed, Isabella walked out onto the garden terrace, seeking solace in the solitude. The moonlight silvered her veil as she opened her sketchbook and began to draw the ballroom, transforming it into a stage of mockery where she had been humiliated, where her worth had been questioned and dismissed. Tears blurred the lines on the page, distorting the images. Ethan found her there, her shoulders trembling with suppressed emotion. He approached her cautiously, his voice low with a mixture of guilt and regret. "Isabella, She turned sharply, her voice steady but edged with a sorrow that pierced his heart. "You said nothing. You let them laugh at me, as if I was less than human, as if I didn't deserve basic respect. Do you have any idea what that felt like?" Ethan's chest tightened with a weight he had never known before, but he couldn't find the words to defend himself, to explain his inaction. He had told himself that their marriage was just a contract, nothing more than a business arrangement, but seeing her broken composure, he felt a crushing wave of guilt, a sense of shame that threatened to overwhelm him. "Perhaps this was a mistake," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. She closed her sketchbook and stepped past him, her gown brushing against the cold stone floor. "If I have to endure this alone, then I will. I don't need your pity, Ethan. I only wanted your respect." Her words struck him like a physical blow, leaving Ethan standing in silence beneath the cold night sky, feeling utterly hollow. For the first time, he realized that his indifference, his carefully cultivated detachment, had not only wounded her deeply, but had also revealed the hollowness, the emptiness, within himself. As Isabella disappeared into the mansion, Ethan clenched his fists, his knuckles white with anger and frustration. The echo of Cassandra's cruel laughter and Isabella's trembling voice collided in his mind, stirring something within him that he could no longer ignore. Something powerful and transformative. This marriage may have begun as an obligation, a duty he couldn't escape. But the cost of his silence, the price of his indifference, had become far too high to bear. Something had to change, and it had to change now. The days after the gala were heavy with silence, an oppressive atmosphere that permeated every room of the mansion. Isabella kept to herself, retreating into the library or seeking refuge in the garden, her sketchbook always clutched tightly in her hand, her constant companion. Ethan tried to approach her, to speak to her, to apologize, but each time he did, her calm, distant eyes reminded him of his failure, his betrayal. He had allowed her to stand alone, to face the world's cruelty without his protection, and that guilt haunted him like a shadow he couldn't escape. The storm of unspoken emotions finally broke during a charity auction hosted downtown, an event that the Lancaster family name demanded they attend. So, Ethan and Isabella arrived side by side, presenting the image of a united couple, though the distance between them felt wider, more insurmountable than ever before. The hall glittered with crystal chandeliers, the sound of forced laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. But beneath the surface, glamour lurked an undercurrent of malice, a simmering tension that threatened to erupt at any moment. Cassandra was there again, her eyes gleaming with cruel delight, sensing an opportunity to further wound Isabella. When the auction paused for dinner, Cassandra approached the table where Isabella sat, her voice dripping with venom. "You should know, Isabella, that everyone here sees right through you. You don't belong in this world, with these people. You're nothing but a shadow, clinging desperately to Ethan's name. Nothing more." Her words drew the attention of the surrounding tables, their whispers growing louder, more malicious. Some smirked with satisfaction, others gossiped with thinly veiled amusement. Cassandra's voice rose louder, her tone increasingly aggressive. Take off that veil, Isabella. Let everyone see the face that Ethan was forced to marry. Let them see why he keeps you hidden away, why he's so ashamed of you." Gasps rippled through the crowd, their curiosity piqued by the drama unfolding before them. Isabella's hands tightened around her sketchbook, her knuckles white. She felt her dignity slipping away, cornered by their cruelty, exposed and vulnerable. Her breath trembled, her carefully constructed composure threatening to crumble. But before Cassandra could reach for the veil, before she could further humiliate Isabella, a firm hand shot forward, stopping her in her tracks. It was Ethan. He rose from his seat, his eyes blazing with a righteous anger that surprised even himself. "Enough, Cassandra," he said, his voice cutting through the room like thunder, silencing the whispers and the laughter. The hall fell silent, every eye focused on him. "You will not speak to my wife that way. Not here. Not ever." The crowd stared in stunned shock, their faces a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. Ethan stepped in front of Isabella, shielding her from their judging gazes, protecting her from their cruelty. For the first time, he stood not as a businessman protecting an alliance, not as a Lancaster upholding a family obligation, but as a man protecting the woman he had come to respect, the woman beside him. Cassandra's smile faltered, her carefully constructed composure cracking under the force of his anger. "Ethan, you can't be serious. Look at her. She's—" "Look at yourself," Ethan snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. "All I see is cruelty dressed in silk. Isabella has more dignity and strength in her silence than you will ever have in all your noise." The room erupted in excited whispers, but Ethan didn't care, didn't acknowledge their presence. He turned to Isabella, his voice softer now, filled with a tenderness he had never shown her before. "Isabella, you don't have to hide anymore." With gentle hands, he reached up and lifted her veil, revealing her face to the crowd. The crowd gasped again, but this time for a completely different reason. Isabella's face, freed from its cover, was luminous, radiant with an inner beauty that shone through her delicate features. She wasn't the ugly woman the rumors had painted her to be, not even close. Her features were delicate, yet strong, her eyes steady and intelligent, filled with a quiet fire that burned with resilience. The truth spread through the room like wildfire, dispelling the darkness of their prejudice. The story of her being unattractive had been nothing but a lie, a malicious fabrication, a weapon crafted by those who envied and despised her, those who felt threatened by her quiet strength. Cassandra's expression twisted with rage and disbelief as the crowd turned, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, but whispering in awe, finally seeing Isabella for who she truly was. Isabella stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in atmosphere. She had never sought to prove herself to these people, never cared for their shallow approval or their fleeting acceptance. But in that moment, standing beside Ethan, finally being seen for who she was, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Justice. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring, not born out of obligation, but out of choice, out of a genuine desire to connect. "From this moment on," he said, his voice steady and loud enough for all to hear, "no one will ever question who you are. You are my wife, and I will stand by you, always." Tears stung Isabella's eyes, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of finally being seen, of finally being valued for her true self. The ballroom blurred around her as Ethan's words anchored her heart, grounding her in a new reality. For the first time since their marriage had begun, she was no longer alone. The night of the charity auction ended with excited whispers chasing Ethan and Isabella out into the cool city air, the murmur of the crowd following them as they made their escape. The limousine ride back to the mansion was silent, but it was no longer the oppressive silence of distance and indifference. It was a heavy silence, charged with unspoken emotions, with words left unsaid, with the weight of their shared history. Ethan sat across from Isabella, his eyes searching her face, desperate to understand her reaction. But she kept her gaze fixed on the window, her reflection blurred by the passing lights, her thoughts carefully guarded. When they arrived at the estate, Isabella moved quickly through the grand hall, her footsteps echoing against the cold marble floors. Ethan followed close behind, his heart pounding with a sense of urgency he had never felt before. He found her in the library, her sanctuary, her sketchbook resting on the table beside her trembling hands. "Isabella," he said, his voice low and urgent. She looked up, her eyes shining with a complex mixture of strength and hurt, vulnerability and defiance. "Why now, Ethan? Why defend me tonight after you left me to be humiliated before, after you stood silently by while they tore me apart? Do you really think that one act of courage erases weeks, months of indifference, of silence, of neglect?" Her words cut him deeply, but he didn't turn away, didn't try to deflect her anger. He stepped closer, his tone steady and sincere. "You're right. I failed you. I let my pride and my fear blind me to your worth. But tonight, when I saw them trying to tear you apart, when I saw the cruelty in their eyes, I realized that I couldn't stay silent any longer. I can't watch you stand alone, not anymore." Isabella's chest rose and fell with each uneven breath, her emotions a turbulent storm within her. "Do you really mean that, Ethan? Or is this just another performance, another calculated move to protect your family's name, to salvage your reputation in the eyes of society?" Ethan shook his head, his voice breaking with genuine honesty. "No, this isn't about contracts or appearances, about business deals or social standing. This is about you, Isabella. I see you now, truly see you, for the first time. I see your strength, your dignity, and the light you carry within you, even when the world tries its hardest to crush you, to extinguish it. I was a fool not to see it sooner, a blind fool." She turned her face away, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I want to believe you, Ethan. I truly do. But my heart can't forget the nights I faced their cruelty alone, the nights you stood silent and indifferent, the nights I felt utterly worthless. I won't be someone's charity case, someone you're suddenly taking pity on. If you're only offering me pity now, I don't need it. I don't want it." Ethan reached for her sketchbook and opened it carefully, his eyes tracing the delicate lines of her drawings, filled with beauty and resilience, with hope and longing. He stopped at the drawing of the cathedral doors, the light breaking through the heavy wood, the image that captured her inner strength. He lifted his gaze to meet hers, his voice thick with emotion. "These drawings, Isabella, they're not the work of someone weak, someone insignificant, someone who deserves pity. They're the vision of someone extraordinary, someone who sees the world in a way that no one else does, someone who inspires me. I don't pity you, Isabella. I admire you deeply and sincerely." For the first time, her eyes flickered with uncertainty, a chink in her armor, a hint of vulnerability. Her walls wavered, shaken by his words. She had endured so much doubt, so much judgment, that her instinct was to protect herself, to shield herself from further pain. And yet, standing before her, Ethan's sincerity pressed against the barriers she had so carefully built, threatening to break them down. "Still," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Words are easy, Ethan. Actions are what truly matter. Showing is better than telling." "Then I'll show you, Isabella." He nodded, stepping back slightly, giving her the space she needed, respecting her boundaries. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll prove to you that I'm not the man who stood in silence, the man who allowed you to be hurt. I'm the man who will stand beside you, always." Isabella closed her sketchbook gently, her fingers brushing over the cover, as if seeking comfort in its familiar presence. She didn't answer right away, the silence hanging heavy in the air, but it carried a different weight now, a weight of hesitant hope rather than outright rejection. The first crack in the wall of mistrust had appeared, and for Ethan, that small crack was enough to ignite a flicker of hope within his heart. That night, as she retreated to her room, Ethan stood alone in the library, staring out into the dark gardens, reflecting on the events of the evening. For the first time in his life, business deals and family expectations meant nothing, held no sway over him. All that mattered was the woman who had been dismissed as ugly, as insignificant, yet had shown him more strength, more resilience, more grace than anyone he had ever known. Ethan Lancaster had begun to fall, and this time there was no contract holding him back, no sense of obligation, only the undeniable pull of his own heart. The days following Ethan's heartfelt confession were filled with an unspoken tension, a palpable sense of anticipation. For the first time, Isabella allowed herself to see glimpses of genuine change in him, subtle shifts in his behavior that hinted at a deeper transformation. He lingered at the breakfast table, instead of rushing out with his phone glued to his ear, engaging in actual conversation, showing a genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. He inquired about her sketches, not as a mere formality, but with genuine curiosity. And as she traversed the hallways of the Lancaster mansion, she couldn't help but notice his gaze lingering on her. It wasn't a look of indifference, but something softer, almost protective in nature. However, the world beyond their secluded walls hadn't become any more forgiving. The rumors persisted, fueled by Cassandra's malicious intent and the envious whispers of those who resented Isabella's sudden elevation in status. The false narrative of her being unworthy continued to cling to her name, tarnishing her reputation. Isabella tried to convince herself that she didn't care, but the weight of the constant scrutiny and the cruel words weighed heavily on her heart. The breaking point arrived during a press conference organized to announce a significant business merger. As Ethan strode onto the stage, cameras flashed, his presence commanding and his voice exuding confidence. Isabella stood beside him, maintaining a composed demeanor, but her chest felt constricted with anxiety. In the front rows, reporters buzzed with whispers, their attention not focused on Ethan's words, but rather fixated on her face. One reporter rose to his feet and, with a smug expression, posed a question. "Mr. Lancaster, rumors have been circulating that your marriage is nothing more than a business arrangement. Some even suggest that your wife hides behind her veil because she is ashamed. How do you respond to these allegations?" The question landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp swept through the room. Isabella's hands clenched at her sides, her sketchbook pressed tightly against her chest. She could feel every eye in the room boring into her, anticipating Ethan's inevitable dismissal of her. But this time, something was different. Ethan stepped forward, his voice firm and resolute. "You are mistaken," he declared. Silence descended upon the room. "This marriage is not a contractual agreement. It is not a charade. And my wife does not conceal herself because she feels shame. She has absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. If anyone should feel shame, it is those who have mocked her and spread lies in an attempt to tear her down." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan turned to Isabella, his gaze unwavering. "Isabella Lancaster is my wife. She is the most resilient person I know, and she has carried herself with grace and dignity while the world has tried to break her. Today, I stand in her defense." He reached for her hand and raised it high for all the cameras to capture. "You wanted a statement here at Island. I will not tolerate anyone speaking of her with malice ever again." The cameras erupted in a frenzy of flashes. Reporters scrambled to capture every angle. For the first time, the public witnessed Ethan not as the cold, unapproachable billionaire, but as a man fiercely defending the woman he loved. Cassandra, who had strategically positioned herself among the guests, paled with fury. Her carefully constructed web of lies had unraveled in an instant. The very crowd that had once ridiculed Isabella now murmured in admiration, their gazes shifting from scorn to awe. After the conference, as the lights dimmed and the cameras were packed away, Isabella turned to Ethan, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why did you do that?" His response was immediate and unwavering. "Because it was the truth, and because I couldn't bear to see you carry this burden alone any longer." She lowered her gaze, her heart caught between disbelief and a flicker of hope. "The world won't change overnight, Ethan." "No," he conceded, "but I will. And I will make sure they see you for who you truly are, Isabella." Isabella clutched her sketchbook tighter, her fingers tracing the outline of the cathedral doors drawn wide open. The glimmer of light she had once sketched was no longer just a dream. It was beginning to feel within reach. For the first time since their arrangement, she allowed herself to envision a future not dictated by contracts, but by genuine choice. And as Ethan's hand tightened around hers, a sense of justice and vindication washed over them both. The world had attempted to label her, to diminish her, but together they had transformed cruelty into a platform for truth. The storm of gossip that followed the press conference was intense but short-lived. For weeks, tabloids endlessly replayed the moment Ethan had raised Isabella's hand for the world to see. Photographs of her unveiled face dominated the headlines. Yet, what truly captured the public's attention was not the revelation of her beauty, but the unwavering conviction in Ethan's defense. The narrative, for once, began to shift. The whispers of ugly and unworthy began to lose their sting. In their place emerged questions of respect, of resilience, and of the quiet dignity that Isabella had carried all along. Within the walls of the Lancaster mansion, life underwent changes that resonated far deeper than the external chatter. The hallways that had once echoed with silence now carried hints of laughter. Ethan no longer retreated to his study until the late hours of the night. He began joining Isabella in the library, sometimes in comfortable silence, other times inquiring about her sketches. He listened intently as she explained the significance behind each line, each image. Slowly, she allowed him glimpses into the parts of herself she had guarded so closely. One evening, Ethan discovered her in the garden, kneeling in the soil beside the roses she had planted with the gardener months prior. The flowers had begun to bloom, delicate yet resilient against the changing seasons. Isabella gently brushed her hand against the petals, and Ethan crouched down beside her. "They survived," she murmured. "They did," he replied, his gaze fixed on her more than the flowers. "Just like you." She looked at him, surprised by the tenderness in his voice. For the first time, she saw not the cold heir to a vast fortune, but a man shedding the armor of pride and fear. He reached for her hand, dirt and all, and held it firmly. "Isabella," he said softly, "I cannot undo the past. I cannot erase the times I failed you, but I promise I won't fail you again. I want this marriage to be more than just a business arrangement. I want it to be real." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She had yearned to hear those words, yet hearing them now felt almost surreal. Slowly, she withdrew her hand, her voice trembling. "Words aren't enough, Ethan. Trust isn't built in a single night." He nodded in understanding. "Then give me time. Let me earn it day by day." And that's exactly what he did. Ethan started standing not only beside her in public, but also with her in the quiet, everyday moments of life. When she sketched, he expressed a desire to learn. When she read, he sat beside her, embracing the stillness he had once dismissed. When she smiled at the staff, he mirrored her kindness, realizing how cold he had been to those who served his household. Piece by piece, he began to rebuild himself, not for the sake of appearances, but for her. The ultimate test came weeks later when Cassandra, desperate and enraged, attempted one final blow. She orchestrated a gathering of influential figures, intending to corner Isabella with more cruel remarks. But this time, as Cassandra's voice dripped with venom across the room, Ethan didn't wait to gauge the crowd's reaction. He stepped forward immediately, declaring with unwavering clarity, "My wife doesn't need your approval, Cassandra. She never did. The only shame in this room belongs to you." The silence that followed was absolute. Cassandra, stripped of her influence, was left with no choice but to leave in humiliation. Isabella watched in awe, not just because Ethan had silenced Cassandra, but because he had done so without hesitation. His actions spoke the words he had promised her. That night, as they returned to the mansion, Isabella stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. Ethan joined her, the cool night air enveloping them. He held out her sketchbook, which she had inadvertently left behind in the library. "You once drew doors," he said softly, opening to the page with the cathedral sketch. "Heavy doors with light streaming through. Do you remember?" She nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. Ethan placed the sketchbook in her hands. "That light, it was always you. You walked into my life when I was blinded by darkness, and you changed everything. Isabella, I don't want a marriage of convenience anymore. I want a marriage of choice. My choice. You." Her breath caught in her throat. He knelt down then, not with the arrogance of a billionaire, but with the humility of a man who had finally learned the true value of love. "Isabella, will you stay with me? Not because of obligation, not because of family expectations, but because we can build something real together." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but a radiant smile broke through. She whispered, "Yes, Ethan, I will." He rose to his feet, pulling her into his arms, and for the first time, their embrace wasn't a performance for an audience, but the beginning of something genuine and lasting. Months later, they stood once again within the walls of a cathedral, but this time it was by choice. No contracts, no business deals, no whispered expectations, only vows spoken with heartfelt sincerity. Isabella walked down the aisle without a veil, her beauty radiant and her dignity shining brighter than any jewel. Ethan's eyes remained locked on hers as he spoke his vows. "This time, I take you as my wife, not because I must, but because I cannot envision a life without you." As their hands intertwined, applause echoed through the hall. The world outside had finally witnessed the truth. Love had blossomed where judgment once thrived. And as they stepped out of the cathedral doors together, sunlight illuminating their path, Isabella opened her sketchbook one last time. On a fresh page, she drew two figures walking side by side through open doors, no longer constrained by shadows. Their story had begun with an arranged marriage and cruel rumors. But it ended with a love chosen freely. A love that had been tested, defended, and ultimately proven. For Ethan and Isabella Lancaster, the contract was a thing of the past. What remained was a promise sealed not on paper, but in their hearts, a testament to the power of love and the triumph of the human spirit.